Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro. Today we're going to take a look at Ngrx Store, which is a state management solution for Angular. So if you're dealing with data that's in a medium to large size Angular application and you're passing it around to different components, it makes sense to use something like Ngrx because it's going to make your life a lot easier, especially when debugging and trying to test your application. So it's built on top of RxJS, which is ReactiveX for JavaScript, and I just did a free course on that. It's about 59 minutes. It's a crash course. It'll help you understand the observable aspect of Ngrx because it's built on top of RxJS. All right, so as always, make sure you subscribe here and also leave a comment. Not enough people are leaving comments. I don't even care if it's bad and you tell me I'm just absolutely terrible. Go ahead, leave a comment, and let's get started. All right, so I'm going to use the Angular CLI to start the new Angular project. But real quick, before we begin, make sure you check out my site, Coursetro.com, where you're gonna find a bunch of courses on modern design and development. A lot are free, and the others you can access for the cost of buying me like a 6-pack each month. That's it. Now also, it probably wouldn't hurt to subscribe here on YouTube, and be sure to make sure the notifications are turned on. All right, let's get back to it. Make sure you have that installed, and you have to, if you want to check it, ng-v, that will give you the version. Go ahead and install it if you don't have that. I'm not going to cover that part yet. So what we're going to do is, once you have it, ng new, and then I'm just going to call this ngrx tut for tutorial, and let this install. All right, it's finished now, so let's cd into that. All right, and now we're going to use a package manager. You could use npm if you want. I'm going to use yarn. So in the case of yarn, it would be yarn add at ngrx/store, and I'm going to hit enter. Also at this point, if you're going to be working with APIs and such, you would also want to include ngrx effects as well, but we're going to keep everything really simple for this tutorial, and then I will release future tutorials where we cover more intermediate topics, but this is just bare bones just to help us get our feet wet and understand everything at a really basic level. All right, so now once that's done, I'm just going to run ng-serve and then -o to open up the browser for us at localhost. Yeah, it's already in use. Oops. All right, I closed the other project, and this time it should work. And there we go. Localhost 4200, it is up. And also, I'm using Commander for my console emulator here, and you can right-click and create a new window or new console, or you can also load up, if you're using a different one, just load up a second one. We'll hop into ngrx tut, and we're also going to run code period if you're using Visual Studio Code to load up the current project. All right, and here it is. We are in ngrx tut. Okay, so at this point, we're going to create a model. So for our fictional project, we're going to allow users to submit both a name and a URL of a fictional tutorial using a simple form. Now, we're not going to be persisting this data in a database or anything because that would really extend the scope of this tutorial way too much. So we only want to focus on Ngrx Store and learning how to use it. So being that we want to store 2 pieces of data in the flavor of an array of objects, we will first define this model. So we're going to head on over, and inside of our source folder, we're going to create a new folder where we'll store the models. In our case, we're just going to have one. All right, and then inside of this models folder, we're going to create a new model. So a file called tutorial.model.ts. All right, so a model, of course, this isn't something that's specific to Ngrx or anything. So we're just going to export interface. We'll call it tutorial. And what is a tutorial going to consist of? Well, a name of string and also a URL of string as well. So go ahead and save that. And now let's talk about actions. So this is specific to NGRX, and an action in Ngrx Store is two things. Basically, first, it's a type in the form of a string, and it basically describes what's happening. Like for instance, it could be add tutorial or remove tutorial or update tutorial. And then second is it contains an optional payload of data. So in the case of adding a tutorial, that payload would be like the name and the URL. And you don't always have to have the payload of data. Like in the case of if you're going to increment some type of number for like a view counter, you wouldn't need any data to pass along. You would just need that type, which is that string, like for instance, increment tutorial count or something like that. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll go and create a new folder. So make sure you're just in your source. We'll create a folder called actions. All right, and inside of here, we'll create a file, and we'll name this tutorial.actions.ts. All right, so at this point, I should note that this entire tutorial that you're listening to, you're watching, is also written. And so the written version is linked in the YouTube description, and it has all the code that we're going to be dealing with. And I'm basically following this written tutorial as I record this recorded version. And so I'm going to be just copying and pasting and then describing bits and pieces of the code. So if you want to do the same, you can. You don't have to sit here typing everything out character for character. All right. So for the very first thing for our actions file is we're going to import. I'm going to hit Control B to get rid of that sidebar. We're just going to import these three lines right here, and just the two relevant bits here would just be the fact that we're importing action from Ngrx Store, being that this is an actions file. We're defining actions, and then also our tutorial model that we just created. Very simple stuff. So for the next section, we're defining two constants. And the first is add tutorial, and we're just naming it tutorial in add. And this is the type. All right. Remember, I mentioned that actions are two things. They're types in the form of a string. Okay. So this is that section. And so right now I'm just creating two for adding and removing. And that should give us, enough muscle memory to work with this. And you can go on your own to do other types as you wish. And then for our third section, I will type this out. And we're going to export a class called add tutorial, and it will implement action. And we're going to define a variable read only, and the name will be type, and it equals our constant, our first constant of add tutorial. And then also we'll have a constructor where we pass in public payload of type tutorial. And if this is confusing to you, don't worry. Basically, at this point, we're creating a class for each of our actions with this constructor right here. And this allows us to pass in the payload of data. And this whole setup right here isn't necessarily required. You can create a more simple version where you don't even create an actions file, and I'll mention that when we get to the reducer section. All right, we're going to do the same thing for remove tutorial. So remove tutorial. All right, and in this time, we don't need a tutorial to pass in. All we need is the index of the tutorial that we want to remove. And you'll see how this works, but in this case, it's just going to be a number. It's an integer, essentially. And normally you'd be persisting this in a database somewhere. Our case, we just need the index from which we can remove the object from the array of objects. All right, and then finally, we want to export a type of actions, and then we reference add tutorial or remove tutorial right here. And this will allow us to access those actions in the reducer that we created shortly. So right here, and again, when it comes to Ngrx Store, One of the areas people would probably be most confused about is this section and also the reducer coming up. But this, you'll start to understand how this works more and more. By the way, these don't necessarily even need a constructor, like I mentioned before, if you don't actually have to pass in any type of data. All right, so let's go ahead and save this, and we'll go Control B here to get up our sidebar. And now we need to create the reducer. So we have our model. Right here, we have our action, and now we create the reducer. All right, so a reducer is what takes the incoming action and decides what to do with it. So it takes the previous state and returns a new state based on the given action and the payload or the data that's coming through. So let's create a reducers folder in source, and we're going to create our tutorial.reducer.ts. All right, so first things first, we have 3 different imports, and we're importing action from Ngrx Store, our tutorial model, as well as all of our actions, and referring all of it as to tutorial actions. All right, so for this next step, if you want to create an initial state with some sort of data, then we'll create it like this, a constant. We can call it default state or initial state, whatever you want. And it'll be of a type tutorial. And then we can just define name, for instance, initial tutorial, and then a URL of google.com. All right, so now let's create the actual reducer. So the way we do that is export function, and we could call this just reducer if we had one of them, and we do, but you may want to name it something a little bit more specific like tutorial reducer or tut reducer or whatever. I'm just going to call it reducer, and we pass in a state of type tutorial, which is an array, and it's going to equal, and this part is where you could either just leave it like this, or if you want to give it that initial state, we can make it equal to that initial state right here. And then for our action, we'll put in tutorial actions dot actions right here. All right, so this is coming from here that we imported, and we have to put a colon there. And then for our reducer, we're going to open this up. And now we use a switch to determine the type of action that's being accessed. So what we do is we type in switch, and then the action.type. All right, so this action.type is coming from right here. And the type, if you recall, if we go to our actions, is defined right here. So the type is add tutorial or remove tutorial. All right, so we open this switch up and we say in the case that our action.type is equal to tutorial actions dot add tutorial. Did I just put actions twice? Yes, I did. All right. Then in that case, we're going to return our state and the action payload right here. Now, if not, we're just going to default to returning the state itself. And the state is whatever is right here as defined. So when we initially call this reducer and the project loads up, the default is by default it's going to return the state until the action type, which will be accessed through the dispatch method, is equal to add tutorial. All right, so you'll understand a little bit more as we go. And we're also going to add another case for removing the tutorial, but we'll do that in a little bit. So we're just going to keep this simple for now and just save it. And we're almost done with the setup work here. We're going to create an app state. So inside of our source folder, we're going to create a file called app.state.ts. And we're going to import tutorial from our models tutorial.model. And then we're going to export an interface of app state, and it's going to be a read-only tutorial, and it's bound to a tutorial array. And if you had multiple models, for instance, if you had like categories, you would import that as well up here, and then also add another line of like read-only category to category array like that. And in our case, we're only going to be using just this one though, but I thought I would mention that. So now let's go to our app module TS file. Oh, and I just realized the reason I couldn't find it is because I've been working in source, but we should have been working in app here. So that's very simple, don't worry. We need to move actions, models, and reducers, as well as our app state into app. Sorry about that. There we go. That's better. Sorry about that again. So what we're going to do now is create that, or go to our app.module file, and now we just have to import a few things. So we're going to import our store module from Ngrx Store, and then also the reducer that we created in tutorial reducer. All right, and then in our imports, after our browser module, we're going to put in our store module that we imported above for root. And then we pass in a property called tutorial, and then we name it reducer. All right, go ahead and save that. And then we want to generate two components for reading and writing to our Ngrx store. So I'm going to go back here, and I'm just going to type ng, G for generate, C for component, and we'll name it read. And then I'll hit the up key, or the up arrow key, and we'll call this one create. All right, great. Now, what we want to do first, we'll handle reading from our Ngrx store. So we're going to open up our read and read component.ts file. And we're going to import 4 different lines here at the top. So the first will be our observable, and we're importing an observable. That way we can define a property as an observable, because that's what's returned from Ngrx Store when we're trying to access our data. And then we're going to import our store, our tutorial model, and our app state from the app state file that we created. All right, so next in the class, we can say, we can define a property and call tutorials. It's going to be an observable of type tutorial. And then in the constructor, we access the store of app. This is where we pass in our app state. And then right here, we can just put this .tutorials equals store.select. And this is the really important part. This is how we actually access our Ngrx store. In this case, we want to select tutorial. And this is coming from, by the way, like, where is tutorial coming from? This is coming from our app module right here, where we bind the property of tutorial to our reducer. And then when this calls the reducer, then it's going to make a call to our reducer, and we'll see that the action type isn't going to be add tutorial. It's going to be something else. It's going to be empty. Default, it's just going to return the original state right here. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to go back to our read component. We'll save that. And now let's open up the HTML. Oops, that's not the HTML. There we go. And we're going to paste in just a little bit of HTML, not much. We're going to say, I don't believe we need this here. If you were working with an API, you would. But we're going to say right here, we just have an unordered list item. We're using ng4 to iterate through our tutorials property that we defined. And we're passing in the async. And this creates and also handles unsubscribing from our observable. And then we bind the href property to the tutorial URL property, which is one of the two properties of our tutorials. And then also we're using interpolation to show the name here. Very simple. So let's go ahead and save that. And let's go to our app component HTML file. This is the default stuff that's generated from the CLI. And we're just going to add in our other two components. So the first one is going to be the app create component, which we haven't worked with yet. And the next one is going to be the app read. And again, these names, by the way, this is all basic stuff. So hopefully you're not a beginner to, let's see here, to Angular, but this is all coming from right here. Each component has a selector. Okay, so also real quickly, I just want to make 3 rule sets in our styles.css, and this is the global CSS style sheet here. And this is just going to make it not look like absolute garbage. So nothing too impressive is happening there. Now let's save it. And with any luck, if you have your the ngserve command still running, there you go. We will see that we have our tutorials and most importantly, our initial tutorial. So let me just show you something real quick. If you didn't want an initial tutorial to show up or an initial state of sorts, then you could go back real quickly to, I hate working with such a small size here. I have a 4K monitor, but I'm recording on a 1920. But if we go to our tutorial, then all we would have to say is save that, just get rid of that portion. There you go. It's not there anymore. But I'm going to leave it there. All right, great. So now we know how to read from our Ngrx store. So now let's talk about writing to it and then to call our add tutorial action. So to do that, let's open up our create and our create component file. So once again, we're going to be importing pretty much the same 4 lines plus another one. So we got our store right here, our app state, our model, and we're also importing our actions because before in our read model, we didn't need any type of action. So for this one, we're importing our actions and then as well the observable. So now, oh, and I just realized we don't even need the observable. We're not defining any type of observables here. We're just dispatching an action. So now in our constructor, again, same thing. We want to access our store, app state rather, and we're going to call a method called add tutorial where we pass in a name and URL from a form, and then we dispatch from the store a new tutorials or tutorial actions rather, and we call add tutorial, and we pass in as an object the name from the name parameter and then the URL from the URL parameter. Okay, so that's all we need for that page. Now let's go to our HTML for our create. All right, and this is real dead simple as well. So all we have here is our 2 inputs with local template variables of name and URL, and then we're just passing them in here. Normally, if you were constructing a form, you wouldn't want to do it this way, but you would probably want to get into reactive forms, which I do have the tutorial for already, but I don't want to bog down any other unnecessary stuff with this tutorial. We're already pretty lengthy. So let's save that. And now let's try adding a tutorial. So if I could find it, there we go. All right, so this is it. Let's say RxJS tutorial. I'll just give it any old URL. Add a tutorial. Voila. There we go. Awesome. So let's also get a little bit more muscle memory and let's talk about removing one of these. So let's say on click, which wouldn't make sense because these are links already. Let's just make it easy. On click that we wanted to remove one of these items, and we'll do it from the store. So let's go ahead and go back to our read component. So Control B, go back to our read right in here. Actually, let's go to the HTML file first. And we're just going to add a click onto each list item. Click event equals, we'll just name this del for delete tutorial, and we're going to pass in I, which is going to be the index, and we define that right at the end here. So we put a semicolon with let I equals the index. Save that, and then we'll go to our read component, and we do have to import. Let's go back to our, I'm going to copy this part right here. We're going to import this because this time we do need an action. All right. And then let's create that method down here, delete the tutorial, pass in the index, and then we say this.store.dispatch. And we're going to make a new tutorial actions, remove tutorial. We pass in the index. And that's it. All right, so now we can't run this yet because if you remember in our reducer, we didn't create the case for remove tutorial. So we're going to take this, we're going to paste this, and we'll say remove tutorial. So in that case, what do we want to do now? Well, in this case, we can return the state, but we'll do that only after running state.splice, the action.payload, which again is just equal to the index or the number, and then we just want to remove 1 from that point. So we'll save, and now we'll go back here, and let's just add one like that, just so we can create some separation. And let's say we want to remove this initial tutorial. Let's click over here to the right. There we go. Awesome stuff. All right, so hopefully it all came together near the end, and now you have a very basic understanding of Ngrx Store. So coming up in, hopefully the near future, I'll also be covering Ngrx Store as well as Ngrx effects, and that's handy for more real-world use case scenarios when it comes to creating applications that that get information from API and start communicating with APIs. Ngrx effects is something that's very necessary for that. All right, so hopefully you found enjoyment out of that. Make sure you subscribe here, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys real soon.